Hello listeners and welcome back to Toolbox Talks on the Sideshed, and you're joining us today for episode 123. And I'm super excited to be bringing this episode because it has been over 12 months in the making. I've been looking for a guest to come on the show to talk about this topic for over 12 months, and I'm super excited that I finally found one. It's something I'm very passionate about, and it's something that I firmly believe has a massive impact on the world. So I'm really excited to be bringing you this podcast. I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Anyway, that's all from me. If you've got any comments, please head across to iTunes, leave us a review. And if you've got any questions, you can head across to the show notes and you can leave some comments there. And that's a wrap. Enjoy. The Sideshed podcast is made possible because of Tradie Web Guys, creators of beautiful websites designed specifically for tradies and contractors. If you're tired of dealing with web designers that have no idea about your industry, then head across to tradiewebguys.com.au and reach out. Like many companies from all over the place, you'll be very glad you did.
Giving tradies and contractors around the globe the tools to run a modern business. You're listening to Toolbox Talks from the Sideshed. Now here's your host, Matt Jones.
Hello listeners and welcome back to Toolbox Talks on the Sideshed. And you're joining us today for episode 123. And I'm super excited to be recording this episode because I have been wanting to record on this topic for the better part of a year. And just recently I met the gentleman who you'll be meeting in a second at a trade show and had a bit of a discussion there. And as a result, we are recording this podcast. So I'd like to introduce to the microphone Stuart from Fytogreen. Stuart, thank you for joining us.
Well, nice to be here, Matthew.
Mate, I've got to be honest, I've been wanting to record something on this topic for a very long time, and I'm thrilled that you've been able to join us here because we've had a lot of people that are also interested in what we're going to be talking about today. So before we dive, I suppose, a little bit into, what it is that we're like, these specific topics, I thought maybe you might be able to give us a little bit of an introduction as to firstly yourself and then secondly, Fytogreen, the company.
Okay. Well, my name is Stuart Tyler. I'm the National Sales Manager for a company called Fytogreen. I've been in that position since 2002. Fytogreen itself was formed by my Managing Director, Jeff Hurd, in 2002. I joined him about a year later in 2004. I got that date wrong earlier. And basically we were friends through kids dropping off at school, and he was setting up this company, which he was explaining was making lightweight roof garden soils. Mm-hmm. And my background is science and Jeff's background is agriculture and commerce. He also is very knowledgeable and is one of the few people in the country that really understands the components that make up lightweight soils and growing mediums, which is the technical term. Now, when I joined him, I said, well, what we need to do to stay ahead is to set up a research program. Mm-hmm. And pretty soon we developed extensive lightweight soils for roof gardens. These are the very thin profile roof gardens where there's a lot of native grasses and ground covers typically are used. And it's usually less than 200 millimetres deep. That's all the soil and drain layers. And then anything taller really is the foliage.
Okay.
And from that research, we got involved in a project called the Victorian Desalination Roof Garden, which is the biggest green roof in the southern hemisphere. And that took out the company from 2 or 3 guys fooling around in a shed to a cast of about 30.
Wow. Okay. Well, look, we've let the cat out of the bag here, and today we're talking about green solutions. And Fytogreen, I suppose you guys do, vertical gardens, rooftop gardens, all this kind of stuff. And I've got to say, Stuart, from my experience, and I've been to a number of different places around the world, and I've a lot of these big cities in various locations throughout Canada and Scandinavia and all these places. They're very proactive in this area, of sustainable rooftops and sustainable gardens and things like that, all the way from commercial applications right through to residential applications. And I feel like we're a little bit behind the 8 ball here in Sydney or in Australia. Would that be accurate to say?
Yes, in some degrees, and no in others. It depends on your perspective. I mean, the building code that builders adhere to is probably a code that takes a while to change.
Right.
So when new technology comes along, light roof garden, lightweight construction of what we do, I'm in the process of actually doing an extension on my own home and putting a roof garden on it. And one of the biggest headaches is going through the permitting process for councils and the companies that do the permitting and surveying and the engineering. It's all new to them, and they are of old school thinking there's a heck of a lot more weight involved and a lot more structures required to keep these things up and safe.
Yep.
So there's a big learning curve there, and there's also an understanding of why you don't need as much structure as before. Okay. And once you get past that, the rest is relatively easy.
Okay.
But that's a big hurdle.
So perhaps before we dive into that, because that is certainly something that I did want to ask you. However, maybe for the listeners out there, you could just talk a little bit about the various products, I suppose you guys specifically do, or maybe even just various products that are available in that green space.
I mentioned our research program, and from that, all our products have been developed. Not just the products, but the processes. And I'll list those. So there's the roof gardens, which I mentioned before. There's the intensive lightweight soil for very deep profiles.
Okay.
There's the extensive lightweight soils for the very thin profiles. And then there's the vertical garden system. Now, we were inspired by Patrick Blanc, the French flamboyant character who sort of put this in the local fashion. But we saw what he was doing and we've improved on it quite dramatically. So we developed our own system. Mm-hmm. Then there's green facades. These are like planter boxes with vines growing up, trellising. Now the trellising, there's a whole range of different types. They can be rods, they can be mesh, they can be stainless steel wires, crisscrossing, all sorts of different ways. The downside on that is the time it takes for the vines to cover the building.
Okay.
So what we approach that with is pre-growing it off-site. It's huge advantages, and it reduces the time for the foliage to cover. From that, we've developed arbors, which are like pergolas without being connected to the floor, so you don't wait for vines to grow up the pergola. You actually grow a curtain that suspends down a curtain of plants from a beam, can be indoors or outdoors. We've got columns that can be suspended that are completely shrouded in plants of varying dimensions. And where you saw me at the design build, we have a few of those suspended on a quaternary system.
Yep.
We have floating gardens. We have just about anything that you can think of that's involving planting on a building structure. And there's so many different variations of a similar theme, and
cool.
We're developing them all the time.
All right, so maybe we can talk a little bit about like application now. So, I mean, obviously when you're developing a new building off the plan, or if you're, lodging a development application or whatever, you would incorporate this specific garden or, vertical garden, rooftop garden, etc. facade in your design. However, what about for things that are already existing? Like what if you wanted to transform an existing rooftop building for rooftop into a garden, for example, or if you wanted to run a green wall up the side of it? What are the applications here?
Yeah, well, obviously new builds you can get with the architect and go through the process with new structure. Mm-hmm. When it's in addition to an existing building or a renovation of an existing building, and we've done this many a times, you first have to get an engineer to certify that the structure can hold the extra weight that you're going to be applying to the roof garden, as an example.
Okay.
Or if it's a vertical garden or green facade, that the host facades or walls can load bear what you're adding to it. Mm-hmm. Then you have to look at waterproofing very, very carefully. Now, on a roof garden, there's hundreds of different waterproof systems out there, but there's only a very few that actually do the job effectively long term. Right. And they need to have root barriers or chemicals in the waterproof membrane itself that resist roots from growing into the actual membrane.
Okay.
And that also needs to be considered for vertical gardens as well.
Yep.
There's always a host wall, and we do many of them indoors. We took that to the nth degree, where we went to waterproof experts and said, what should we do to stop roots and moisture causing structural damage inside? And so we now have specifications for what the waterproof system should be doing.
Okay, so I mean that sounds all good for, I suppose, like a new development, a new home, a new building, whatever it is. How would you tackle that scenario with an existing building that has an existing type of material for the facade, and it how do you go about modifying, or what's the word I'm looking for here, like trying to retrofit, I suppose, these waterproofing solutions to an existing location?
Exactly. You got to do the same process as if it's a new build. You got to get an engineer to check the existing roof. As an example, if we look at it for roof garden, that structure can take the weight.
Yep.
And you've also got to get a waterproof consultant to make sure you get the right waterproofing for the roof garden, knowing there's a roof garden going on there.
Okay.
And it's the same for if you're retrofitting a green facade and a vertical garden as well. Once you've got past those two, then the design process can go ahead quite clearly.
Mm-hmm.
But the other two unknowns on a existing building, until you get that understanding, it's guesswork.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. All right, cool. So what about other locations? Like, off the top of my head, I'm thinking things like parks or like residential or buildings that are owned by the council, and just things like that, like community sort of related developments. Are there any other applications for those sort of things as well?
Oh, absolutely. Council, state level government, federal level government, and universities, public spaces.
Yep.
All of those places benefit from having green walls and green roofs. Green walls and green facades more so because they're more visible.
Right.
Whereas green roofs are usually only for the building occupants or the neighbours looking down on it.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't get as much of the wow factor, although there are still pretty good benefits for them. But we get a lot of projects with government involvement at various levels.
Okay, cool. So, I definitely want to get into that in a little while. I suppose before we do, though, I'd just like to maybe keep talking about some of these considerations. So we spoke about waterproofing. We've spoken about structural capacity. Just on structural capacity, is it, in your experience, is it often an area of development that perhaps may reject a rooftop plan, the structural capacity, or does it normally comply?
That really depends on the structure itself.
Okay.
And I can't comment on it because I'm not an engineer.
Okay.
What we provide to the engineers are the saturated weight profiles, say for an extensive roof garden. And an example of that in Sydney is the Grounds Cafe market area. There's an extensive roof garden we built there on an existing shed. And so in that scenario, we would have supplied the engineer with full saturated weight, including the plants, so that they know what they call the full dead load of the structure. The engineer would say, well, then this complies, it can hold that, blah, blah, blah. They add a little bit more for live load for a maintenance person to go up there and do the maintenance visits, 2 or 3 times a year. And they obviously add in a safety factor over and above that as well.
Yep.
And that was a starting point for the design.
Cool. Okay. And then what about things like irrigation, drainage, all that kind of stuff?
Okay, well, irrigation comes with our system. So we supply not just the roof garden soils and the plants, we supply a completely automated irrigation system. And there's ranges of different sophistication in terms of irrigation. For instance, a very large one like the desalination plant, which is 2.7 hectares, we have back-to-base monitoring with a modem via the automated computer that operates it all in separate zones. We also have weather stations on there that are telling us what's going to happen. And it's all to make sure that we can predict what water is required and keep the irrigation regime as efficient as possible without wasting water. Now, underneath the soil profile, there is a drain layer, which is all part of our system, which is 20 mils deep. And basically that channels all the water that's finished percolating through the soils and drops out the bottom as such. And we want that water to go away as fast as possible. We don't want it ponding or sitting for any time on top of the waterproofing.
Right.
And if you know waterproofing, if you have water sitting there for any period of time, it's a big problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's potentially a big trouble, I should say. And so when we look at the drawings, we're always looking at the drainage, and we often supply typical drawings on what they should consider. If it's an external gutter or an internal gutter, if it's with the downpipes, inspection ports should be there as well. So we go through that through the design development process, usually with the architect and often with the engineer in the background.
Okay, that's interesting. So in the instance where you maybe, like, let's just use the grounds at Alexandria as an example, they obviously already had a roof there, which was already draining to a certain point. How did you have to alter the pitch of the roof? Did you have to change the drainage scope? Like, what was the deal there?
Okay, well, the deal there was pretty much the roof structure was what it was, and it had already been built to know there was going to be a roof garden before we got involved.
Okay.
Now, the pitch of it is actually 30 degrees, and pitch is quite important. Once you get above a certain pitch angle, in our case, it's usually about 14, 15 degrees.
That's a big...
You need to start retaining the soil so they don't slide off the bottom.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of things we do for that. We use another product called geo-webbing, and putting geo-webbing into the soil profile is not easy. It's something that many landscapers will not have experience with, and we've seen some disasters on this. Okay. And we actually work with geo-webbing to develop the system to work properly. Yeah, and right. It's not easy. And so when you get up to a pitch of 14, 15 degrees, the technicality of installing it and the cost starts to increase a little because of the fact that you got to get things absolutely right. And that's the thing with extensive roof gardens. You've got very little tolerances now. So often a general landscaper who'll be using traditional soils can get into a lot of problems very quickly because of the tolerances that you have. You need to have various things exactly done properly in the right process. Otherwise, it starts to cause problems not only at install, but later on. So with the grounds, we put in the geo-webbing system. We also had an L profile that sits at the bottom that retains all the soil particles in place, but it's perforated to allow egression of water.
Okay, so it's almost like baffles kind of for the soil.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But if you think of it, stainless steel L profile, with the bottom of it, which we've developed this piece of edging or parapet, should we say, at the lower edge, so that you can attach it without penetrating into the roof because of the waterproofing issues. Okay. So the weight of the roof garden itself sits the L profile in position, and all the geo-webbing is all tied back to the apex of the building at the top. And that all has to be engineered correctly, knowing what the weight and the pitch is, because that's all loaded back to the top.
Yeah, right. Cool. Okay, so what about things like, and I don't know if you'd classify this as a consideration or more of an advantage or a serendipity, but what about things like insects and wildlife?
That's interesting. I mean, of course, once you start creating gardens on structure, be it a vertical, green facade, and roof garden, you're actually developing an ecology.
Right.
We actually have a botanist as part of our design team, and he designs what he says ecologies. So there's a mixture of plants, and they all have different, should we say, fauna that are attracted to it, or insect life that are attracted to it. Okay. Once you get and you can't keep the insects away, they'll come.
Yeah.
And once you get the insects there, then the birds, and then all the other bird predators, everything comes into it. The big problem that we have is possums, to make sure we don't put species that possums will chew. And we have made that mistake. Once out at DYRSL, we did a vertical garden, and it got absolutely decimated by possums. And so we had to change the species that they were attracted to species that they are not attracted to, but keep the aesthetic looking nice.
I was going to say, I noticed I noticed the possum disappeared here at my place for a while. Maybe that was when they were eating your garden.
Yeah. They knew there was a party in DY, that's for sure.
Okay, what about some of the thermal advantages?
Right.
Or thermal properties, I should say.
Yeah, well, of course, putting a lot of soil on top of a roof, you can imagine the thermal masses has increased quite dramatically. Yep. Now, the building code says you've got to build with certain R values in terms of keeping the warmth in, and this comes from the northern hemisphere. You know, a lot of our building code comes from the UK or United States, and all the history that they had, where they're trying to keep warm in the house. Right. But roof gardens actually keep warmth out of the house. So, for instance, if you've got a hot day out there, you're going to reduce the requirement to putting air conditioning on with a extensive roof garden on. And that's part of the reason why I'm putting mine on. And so what we're actually looking at is the benefit of reducing air conditioning and having air conditioning switched on. And of course, that doesn't mix into the R value. So I can't give you an R value of what the roof garden is going to be. Right. There's a lot of research been going on about this where they take snapshots and measure R value. But of course, there's water in your roof garden. There's water in the soil, there's water in the drain layer, and there's water in the plants itself, and they're transparent. So whatever R value that you do measure for those three zones, it immediately changes if you go back and remeasure it.
Yeah.
So you can measure potentially a range, but that's not good enough for the building code. They need to have a minimum R value of whatever. I think it's 4.5 or whatever it is that they have to have. So often we have to put the insulation in below the roof garden for that minimum R value, but you still retain the benefit of keeping hot air out.
Right.
And of course, the other benefits are reducing echo in a city, attracting animal life and birds, as we were talking about before, increasing the filtration of VOCs and carbon dioxide out of the air and replacing it with oxygen enrichment. And that happens wherever you have plants. It's not necessarily a roof garden, but if you can add more roof gardens or vertical gardens or green facades into the city, you're filtering the air, you're purifying the air.
Yeah, right. And this was something I did want to actually ask you about. Is that the case? Because that's quite an interesting. I mean, you look at some of these cities today, and it's just such a concrete jungle. You sort of wonder what's happening to that whole, air filtering situation. Especially in the bigger cities. So that's pretty interesting.
It is, and if you can bring in plants on a grander scale than just a pot plant here and there with vertical gardens, green facades, and roof gardens, you're having a very good positive impact in purifying the air. I mean, plants are the lungs of the planet. If we didn't have plants with all the pollution that we're doing with fossil fuel burning, we'd be in dire straits already.
Yeah.
As you know, with global warming and environmental change, it's pointing in the wrong direction. And this is a step to try and reduce the speed that we're going in that wrong direction.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, and from a maintenance point of view, I mean, obviously, I'm guessing if you get the pitch of the roof right, you get from a rooftop garden perspective here, if you get the pitch of the roof right, you get your waterproofing right, you get your drainage right, I'm guessing maintenance should be minimal. Is that fair to say?
It is. All gardens need maintenance,
yes.
And there's no maintenance gardens. They're called ashtrays. And when you have a roof garden, you should be able to get up there safely. And on commercial buildings, there's usually rope access, and there's usually fall protection systems with anchoring systems so that your man clips on or woman clips on. Mm-hmm. And if they do fall over the side, they don't fall to their death. Mm-hmm. They're in a harness, and you obviously need your horticulturalists to be elevated platform work tickets so that they can do work at high areas safely.
Yep.
And that's all good. On a residential scale, probably get away with that a little bit more than probably what you should.
Yeah.
It's not as policed, should we say, as stringently as on a construction site. Mm-hmm. But you still need to adhere the same things. You still need to do safe work practices, and a good builder does without even thinking about it.
Yeah.
And that should be taken into account in the design of the roof garden. There's either a balustrade there or a clip-on place if there's no balustrading for someone to get into that place to fertilise, prune, and just check that everything is working properly.
I suppose I was thinking more in the terms of like maintaining the garden as opposed to compliance, but that's a valid point, I suppose. Obviously, everything has to be, done with work-safe practices in place.
Yeah, well, the maintenance is relatively low getting back to that point, but you do need to probably get to a roof garden, as an example, at least 2, if not 3 times a year just to check and feed, making sure all the thing is working properly. Mm-hmm. When it's vertical gardens, it's a bit more of a maintenance requirement. We do this on a contract basis annually, and we usually visit once a month. But we get all up close and personal over the whole wall probably about 4 times a year.
Yeah. And
that's where access needs to be considered. With green facades, the first year of growing the vines is probably the biggest maintenance burden because you're training the leaders to go in the right direction.
Yeah.
And so that requires often very frequent visiting periods to make sure you get that growth in the right direction.
Yeah.
After you get it to, establishment, you still need to be there, 4 times a year, pruning everything that you need to.
I think we pretty much covered most of the important things that I wanted to talk about there anyway. So I wouldn't mind moving on a little bit to what you mentioned before, Stuart, in relation to some of the permits, compliance, building compliance, regulations, qualifications, etc.
Okay. Well, I can only sort of describe that from personal experience because I've gone through the process of extending my house and putting roof gardens on.
Oh, okay. Yep.
And a lot of it was an educational process for the engineers, and I used draftspeople to come up with the plan that I had in my head.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to hold their hand and provide them with the information. And then the compliant company, and I live in the Mornington Shire in Victoria.
Lovely.
And they have commercialised all this building surveying and permitting to commercial companies. And so they also needed to be educated and basically taken on the journey of putting a green roof because they haven't had any experience on it.
And is that an expensive expedition?
It wasn't so much expensive as time-consuming,
Yeah.
and I was quite lucky because I'm in the industry, so I knew where to go to get consultant, expert, independent.
Yeah.
And I do it with speech quote, air quotes, advice,
Yeah.
so that the permitters were feeling comfortable. It wasn't just me driving it on my own, even though they knew I was from a green roof supplying company. But I had to get independent consultants to help me along that, so that the permitter was comfortable.
So in terms of, say, state regulations or federal regulations or, I don't know, building code or whatever it is, are there certain things that need to be complied by beyond your standard, building code of Australia sort of scenario?
The main things that they were concerned about was obviously the weight loading, and I wasn't using concrete for the structure for my roof garden.
Yeah.
I was using a lightweight structure, so as in 25 mil plywood and beams and so forth.
Mm.
And so it was getting the balance right of that being engineered correctly and strong enough and not going to break my budget in a different area.
Yeah.
And that balance was a fine one. Secondly, was the waterproofing. They wanted to make sure that the waterproofing was as it should be, and so did I. And that's why I only considered using the Seeker Sarnafill system.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to get independent advice from actually someone who actually was on the committee of writing the specifications in the building industry for balconies, bathrooms, etc., and waterproofing on that. So fortunately, I had him as a contact, and he wrote a lovely report for me, which helped me.
Okay. So I suppose just in relation to all this stuff, if there's people out there listening, and I can guarantee there are people out there listening that are quite interested in this topic, what would be a framework that you would recommend for them to go down if they were looking at perhaps, putting a rooftop garden on their home or a green wall? Like, who do you speak to? Do you just go straight to you guys, or like, what's the go?
Look, it depends on the scope and size of the project.
Yeah.
If, for instance, there's a reasonable scope, size, shall we say, for the green wall, the green facade, or the roof garden, as an example, you obviously need to engage an architect.
Yeah. Now,
an architect will have in the background an engineer, and they need to be brought up to speed if they haven't already with what the engineering requirements are, and we help them with providing that information. Now, we work with a lot of architects and landscape architects,
mm-hmm.
and a lot of that information is out there and freely available. So there's many that are already up to speed with this.
Okay. All right. So if people are interested, it's things that they can get hold of. It's not like you don't have to be in the industry and know Bob who works for XYZ in order to get. Okay.
Not really. I just relayed that as my personal experience, and it's different in different areas, of course, because I don't know what a council in Western Australia would be, and be quite different to the approach in Sydney as in Brisbane, etc.
Right. So there is that local level of jurisdiction that you do have to get past, which I suppose that comes with the DA. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. So let's. I suppose we're getting towards the end now. I'd like to ask a little bit more about some of the practical advantages. Now, I know you mentioned earlier in the recording that where the green wall solutions are somewhat more visual as opposed to the green roof solutions, which are a little bit more, I don't know if practical is the right word, but I'm envisaging a rooftop garden as a place where, you can grow produce and you can grow your own vegetables or fruit or whatever it is, and you can source it from basically yourself. Is that relatively accurate?
It's true. In fact, we did a project called 38 Westbury Street in East St Kilda.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the owners of that have blogged everything about it. It's on the webpage. So if you look up 38 Westbury Green Roof, there's a lady there called Sonia Bodner, She drove the whole project. And what blew her away, sorry, this is my language, not hers, was when they put the roof garden on what was a 3-story apartment block built back in the 50s, and it had the structural engineering check, had the waterproof update, and everything was kosher. Put the roof garden on, is the whole apartment block, and there were 20 apartments. Instead of having hallway conversations and saying hello and so forth, they now have a community on the roof where they meet regularly. They do the working bees to look after the gardens. They're growing veggies collectively. They've got a beekeeper on there. They have yoga on the roof. And everybody's relationship has changed.
It's like a community.
Correct. And they spend a lot more time up there, heck of a lot more time. And if you see pictures before and after, you'll understand why. And also the property values have increased dramatically because no one wants to vacate as tenants. Really? And the owners don't want to sell. So if you get the community benefits right and the environmental benefits right, the financial benefits come along. And that wasn't their aim. Their aim wasn't a financial benefit, but that's what they're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that there'd be so many, so many of those little serendipities, you know, that you may not foresee. I'm even thinking from a kid's point of view. You know, I remember listening to, I think it was a TED talk a couple of years ago, and it was a fellow that was talking about he was an ex-LA gang member actually. And he went out and he got involved with the community as part of his rehabilitation. And as a result, he ended up setting up lots of little council-owned gardens around the place where it became like a community hub. And the aim was to get kids away from gangs and into gardening. And it was just a fantastic story. I'll try and find it. I'll post it in the show notes. But he was talking about, you know, his catch cry was if they grow it, they'll eat it, you know. And it was talking about how, you know, just you give kids something to do that's practical, you know, and it can make a huge difference. So I imagine it's a similar sort of thing.
Oh, that's right. And as an educational tool for the parents and the children in these apartments, it's all positive.
Of course.
It's reintroducing, I mean, a lot of children today in metropolitan areas haven't been to farms and orchards. I mean, as a kid, I grew up in those areas, but and a lot of people are so divorced from where food comes from. And if you start doing it on your roof like this, it brings it all back. And there's huge benefits in that.
Now, a colleague of mine, Scott, he actually had a business a little while ago, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure if it's still running. I should probably reach out to him. However, he had a rooftop, I'm sure it was a rooftop garden business of some description, and they were dealing more with unit blocks, commercial buildings within Sydney, and their thing was about creating rooftop gardens that had produce on it they could sell to local restaurants within a 5-kilometre radius or a 3-kilometre radius or something like that. Is that something you've ever heard of before?
Yes, there was a documentary about 2 years ago about rooftop farming. I think it was based on a New York example.
Okay.
Where what they're really looking to do there is reduce the carbon footprint for where your vegetables grow and where they get consumed.
Yep.
The practicality of that, you do need a lot of space for it because as in vast areas, as you can imagine, I mean, we've done a few projects where they've sort of advertised, you know, the local herbs used in this restaurant are grown on the roof. But you'd have to have a very big roof to be able to keep up with the demand of a restaurant, as an example, a semi-successful restaurant.
Yeah,
so
okay.
It's a compromise there. But there are benefits in doing that. And, of course, you're creating more work and everything inside. But you do need to I think we're a little way away from doing it to that scope and range and size to meet the demand.
I could be wrong. I think they were focusing more at that stage on things like herbs. And I mean, I don't think the vegetables got much more extreme than, you know, tomatoes and things like that, like quite manageable stuff. But
yeah,
they certainly won't. I don't think there was pumpkin vines growing across the roof or anything like that.
Yeah,
but
no, that's right. It'll probably work a lot easier on some crops as opposed to others. But if you're going to have like a veggie garden on your roof to sustain your house, your roof may not be big enough.
Yeah, okay. I thought that was quite an interesting strategy, though, because it's kind of it attacks a number of different problems with one solution there, you know, that whole rooftop garden. So, I mean, like you were saying before, with all the thermal properties and, you know, cooling advantages, and then you've got the gardens on the roof where you can grow produce and you can community aspect, and then you can also, it's cost saving because you're growing your own food. It's potentially income generating because you can perhaps sell it to local restaurants. It's great for them because they're, as you said before, their carbon footprint's less, and the food is fresh and it's sourced on, within the local area, and like there's a lot of advantages to it. I know as well. I was reading an article, it popped into my newsfeed a little while back, and it was talking about in New York City now, they're actually selling honey, which is specific to the corners of various streets. So you might have a honey that's come from 36th and 3rd, and then you might have another honey that's been a few blocks down, and it's all locally sourced and locally sold. But I thought that was really interesting. So now they're actually growing there's bees on the roof, and it's producing honey within the big city.
Yeah, I've heard examples of that in Melbourne actually, okay. And that project I mentioned before, 38 Westbury, one of the apartment owners has a hive. I think he was supposed to be located on the roof as well.
Yeah,
because there's many species that flower obviously on a roof, and also all around the properties.
Brilliant. You know what? I'm looking at that website right now. I'm certainly going to reach out to Sonia and see if she'd like to share her experience. I think it's be a brilliant follow up to this episode.
Oh, look, she'll be a fantastic person to talk to. She'll talk you through the whole journey of how she went from idea, the thought bubble, right through to getting it done. And she managed to get a state-level grant to fund it. And she's done the cost analysis on what the return would have been if they'd all put in the money in the first place.
Yeah, right.
And it's all positive. It's all very positive for them.
Amazing. Well, look, I'm conscious of your time, Stuart. I think we'll probably wrap that up here, unless there's anything that you'd like to add or anything that you think I might have missed.
Oh, look, there's lots of examples out there, especially in Sydney. We just installed a roof garden on Bondi amenity block. There's Bear Park. There's a few public places where there's roof gardens around, and everyone knows Central Park.
Yeah.
For vertical gardens and green facades. There's one Bly Street, which we installed back in 2010. I mean, there's lots of examples to go and see, and all of that can be done on a residential scale.
Yeah, wow.
And we're doing more and more on a residential scale as time goes on.
That number one Bly Street's incredible.
Yeah, I quite like it.
It's amazing. Anyway,
there's some challenges there, but it's a lot of fun.
And Stuart, just before we go, where can listeners come to get some more information on either rooftop gardens or vertical gardens or Fytogreen? The website.
Our web page is the W's fytogreen.com.au.
Yep.
We have Facebook, and we have Twitter and Instagram.
Okay. Cool. I'll have a dig around. I'll post some links to all that stuff in the show notes there. But if the listeners out there, if you guys do want to reach out, you can head across to Fytogreen. That's fytogreen.com.au. And all the social media links are on that webpage there. I'm actually looking at it right now. And I'm sure they'll be able to reach out and get hold of somebody as well if they need to. Is that right, through the website there, Stuart?
Yeah, my contact details are on the website, and I'm happy to take any calls about this.
All right. Absolutely brilliant. Well, listeners, I hope you got as much out of that as I did recording it, because as I said, I've been looking at I've been wanting to tick that box for a while now, and I'm super glad I did. So if you've got any questions, by all means, you can either post comments within the comments section on the show notes, or you can head across to Fytogreen and reach out to Stuart directly. I am definitely, Stuart, going to reach out to Sonia and see if she'd like to share some experiences. So I will let you know the proceedings of that conversation. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. And I just want to say, keep up the good work.
Thanks, Matthew.
Okay, listeners, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to another episode of Toolbox Talks. If you're liking what you hear, then you can head across to thesiteshed.com, where you can join our community by signing up to our Toolbox Talks. You'll get sent a weekly notification, which is basically a highlight of everything that we've spoken about during that week, along with any other industry news that may be relevant or specific to the trades. If you're enjoying the show, you can head across to iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, where you can leave us a review. That would be fantastic, and all the reviews get read out in the show. Likewise, if you have any friends or colleagues that you think would benefit from the show and the episodes that we create, then please go ahead and share it with them.